Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, PSC 201, whatever time you're consuming this little bit of educational media. I am again your American government instructor, Victor McInnes, coming to you live on tape from my coronavirus compound in Grovetown, the Aiken Tech Outpost in Columbia County, Georgia. Today, our lecture is brought to you by your pets. Your pets. Even if you're not going outside today, your pets would really like for you to take a shower anyway. All right, so we're moving on to chapter 13, and this will be winding up our course. We're sort of bringing everything full circle, bringing it all together. We're going to be talking about elections today and in our next lecture, and these will be the final two lectures of the course. So you'll see how we've walked through the three branches of government, how they're supposed to interact together. Oh yeah, by the way, if you haven't already opened it up, the slides are for this lecture are on the documents page, chapter 13, part 1. Go ahead and open that up. I'll just sort of talk through it, and if you need to, hit pause so that you can get everything done. So we've talked through all three branches of government. You know, the Congress set up in Article 1, the executive set up in Article 2, the court set up in Article 3. We've walked through, we've talked about the bureaucracy, we've talked about civil liberties and civil rights. So now we're going to be talking about, and all this stuff is beginning to come together. So now we're going to start talking about elections, where the rubber hits the road. Now, the first thing I wanted to, we have this myth within the United States that one man, one vote. We say that all the time. We claim that everybody who's an American citizen should get the right to, should be allowed to vote. And to be honest with you, that just flat out isn't true. I want you to go from that first election slide, which shows all these people voting. Go down to the next slide, 2018 Georgia governor's race. So the two people you see here, the one on the left is Stacey Abrams, former Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives, what they call here in Georgia, the leader of the House. And then the person on the right is Brian Kemp, who was at the time of the election the Secretary of State of Georgia. And remember, we've talked about how the Secretary of State of all the states are responsible for running the elections. So Stacey Abrams, former Democratic leader in the House of Representatives, was running against Brian Kemp, the serving Secretary of State of Georgia, when coming up to the election. Secretary of State Kemp invoked a Georgia law that had not been used much, if at all, in the past. Under Georgia law, registered voters who have not cast a ballot for 3 years are asked by mail to confirm that they still live at their addresses. If they don't respond, they are marked as inactive. If they don't vote in the next two general elections, they can be removed from the voter rolls. Now, I want to stress that had been the law for quite some time, and nobody had bothered to enforce it. Excuse me. Pollen here in Georgia is bad. So if they don't vote in two or more general elections after that, they're removed from the rolls. So right before the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial race, then Secretary of State Kemp's office purged more than 340,000 voters from the voter rolls using this law. And it turns out that 80% of them were Black, Latino, or Asian. So the Secretary of State, who was involved in the gubernatorial race, uses his office to eliminate 340,000 people off the voter rolls who probably were taken off improperly. Now, there was almost 500,000 people that were purged from the voter rolls. Some of those, roughly 150,000 of them should have been purged. But 340,000 of them were arguably improperly purged from the voter rolls because they either didn't receive that mail notice, they weren't informed that they were being removed. A lot of these people just went to vote on the day and they weren't allowed to vote. So in the vast majority of those, 80% of those were minority voters, Blacks, Latinos, and Asians. Now, Kemp then wins the election by by 55,000 votes approximately. So clearly, 300,000 voters being taken off the rolls could have had a significant impact on on that election. And we see that pattern happening over and over again, where people are trying to redefine who should and should not be allowed to vote. So we go to the next slide. So we talk about who should be allowed to vote, that every American should be allowed to vote. One man, one vote. So let's go to that next slide. Who gets to vote? And this is, the Constitution says very, very little in its original, in who gets to vote. Article 1, Section 2 says, basically, it's up to the states, The 15th Amendment said that any person, no state can deprive a person of the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th said no state deprived any person of the right to vote on the account of sex, and we're going to talk about the 19th Amendment in detail in just a second. The 24th Amendment said no state can require payment of any tax or condition as a condition, so that eliminated the poll tax. And the 26th Amendment said no state can deprive any person who is at least 18 years of age. That 26th Amendment dropped the voting age. And then previously, the Equal Protection Clause said that no state can make a distinction for voting purposes between those who do and those who do not own property. Okay? And we're going to talk about that in just a second as well. But what you notice in every single one of those, look at the first two words of all of those. Any state, no state, no state, no state, no state, no state. So the Constitution gives the power to determine who has the right to vote to the states. There is no constitutional amendment. It's not written anywhere in the Constitution that you, as a U.S. citizen, has the right to vote, and that is a constitutionally protected by the federal government. The Constitution, over and over again, devolves that down to the state level and allowing the states to protect it. And that is, again, we've already talked about civil rights and civil liberties. We've talked about the civil rights movement and how people were prevented from executing their right to vote. But the states were allowed to do that until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Go to the next slide where it says who gets to vote. And it shows you exactly what we're talking about here. In the early 1800s, the qualification to be a member of a specific religion and have property ownership and tax payment qualifications. And then, who became eligible to vote? White males. And you're going to see that over and over again. In the 1870s, many people in the South, former slaves, African Americans, were systematically prevented from voting, even though the Constitution said they should have. But again, remember, the Constitution turns that control of that and the execution of that and the operationalization of that over to the individual states. In the 1920s, women were given the right to vote, but we're going to see in just a minute, women being given the right to vote doesn't mean all women got to vote. In the 1960s, the Voter Rights Act was passed, and voters of the District of Columbia were allowed to vote in presidential elections, which, believe it or not, because the District of Columbia was supposed to be separate and removed from the political hurly-burly of our government, citizens of the District of Columbia were not allowed to elect their local government. It was appointed by the Senate. It was almost as if they were a foreign territory located right between Maryland and Virginia. And then in the 1960s, different states had been setting different minimum ages to vote because you can't trust a teenager with something important like the vote. And then suffrage, and again, suffrage as the right to vote was allowed for 18 years old. But again, as you see here, there has been never in the concept of our government, our American history, the concept that everybody gets to vote. Like we like to say, you guys, every member of this class, everyone that should be looking at this lecture, you guys know you're not allowed to vote. You don't get to vote in any elections until you turn 18. And why did they pick 18? I don't have an answer for that. You were considered to be mature enough when you were 18, but not mature enough when you were 17. For a long time, you weren't considered mature enough until you had reached your legal majority, which was 21. So that constantly changes. So let's talk about women's suffrage. And you're going to find, and go to the next slide, you'll see the pictures of the suffragettes. Again, we've talked about this before. The suffragettes like to wear white. They wore white as a symbol of their determination, of a symbol of their purity, of their cause. And now you'll see whenever the president addresses the joint houses of Congress, the Democratic women of the House of Representatives and some senators will all wear white to honor their suffragette ancestors. So what we're going to see, and we've got 2 or 3 slides here that will sort of run down the timeline of women's suffrage. You see that things don't move in a straight line. We go forward, we go back, we go forward, we go back. And the big thing is, before the revolution, before the Constitution was passed, several states, including New York, and that should be New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, northern states actually gave women the right to vote. They allowed them to vote in local elections. They allowed them to vote in state elections. Remember, they weren't allowed to vote for like the governor because the governor was appointed by the king of the United Kingdom. But women were allowed to vote. And then when the Constitution was passed in 1787, all of those rights were taken away. And again, in other states, in some of those states, the right to vote the suffrage was given to women, and then they would take it to court, and the federal courts would take it away, saying there's no constitutional right for women to vote because the white men just didn't believe that women should be allowed to vote. And white men, as we go through all of this, the people who are passing these laws are in most cases, until the very, very end, white males. Okay, in 1838, Kentucky is one of the first states to give any voting rights to women, and they give the right to vote to rural female heads of households in some elections, like school board elections, county commissioner, local elections. They didn't get to vote for governor, they didn't get to vote for president, but they did get some voting rights. Now, in 1848, this is a very important date. You need to remember this. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention came together. It was a lot of activists for women's suffrage. They were addressed by Frederick Douglass, I believe. And it is from this convention where everything else we're about to talk about became organized. They worked harder. And they tried to push things forward. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention sort of bonded the women's suffrage movement together, and they began to move forward as an organized movement as opposed to just individuals. So, but in 1867, after the Civil War, you think that everything's going to be, better, everything is going to be fine. But Kentucky votes against. They have a vote in the state. Should white women and black males get the vote? And the answer was no. And guess again, that is just an example of white males protecting the franchise, and the franchise is another way of saying the vote. By denying white women and black males, you ensure that white males maintain the power in Kentucky. In 1869 and 1870, the territories of Wyoming and Utah grant unrestricted female suffrage. You can vote for anything. Now remember that as a territory, they're not necessarily going to be voting for president. They're not states. They don't have members of the Electoral College. But they were allowed to vote in all other state and local elections. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony registers to vote, the great crusader for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony registers to vote in New York. She's immediately arrested and fined $100. That case went through courts forever, and Susan B. Anthony just refused to sign it and told the state of New York, if you want to come get me, you know where to find me. She was never rearrested for not paying the fine. But in 1872, Susan B. Anthony registers to vote in New York. She cast the ballot in New York, and she is immediately arrested and fined $100. Let's go to the next slide. So throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century, women lose the vote in Utah in 1887. Women lose the vote in Utah and Washington, but win it in Kansas in municipal elections. 1889, Wyoming insists they'll keep women's suffrage if they're admitted as a state. In 1893, first time this had ever happened, Colorado, who limited suffrage to white males, voted for women's suffrage. But in 1894, the next year, voters in New York collected 600,000 signatures on a petition to put women's suffrage on the ballot. And the state of New York just quite illegally, let's say, ignored it. In 1896, women's suffrage returns to Utah as soon as they gain statehood. Idaho grants women's suffrage. The first 1908, they've become organized to the first suffrage march in the United States is held in Oakland, California. 1910, women get the vote in Washington. 1911, women secure the vote in California. 1912, Arizona, Kansas, and the territory of Alaska grant women the vote. And then in 1916, a very famous person, Jeannette Rankin, is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Okay, let's talk for a second about Jeannette Rankin. Jeannette Rankin is a lot of people disagree with her. A lot of people are very angry at her at the time. Jeannette Rankin has a whole lot of unique places in the U.S. House of Representatives. So I want you to understand this. She was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives even though she wasn't allowed to vote in Montana. That needs to be understood. So that is a really phenomenal piece of history. Jeannette Rankin is, even though she's disliked by a lot of people, she is respected by everyone. Jeannette Rankin holds a unique place in American history. She was a staunch pacifist. We may have already talked about her. She was a staunch pacifist. She is the only person in either house of the House of Representatives or the Senate that voted against going to war in both World War I and World War II. She was the only person that voted against going to war in World War II on either side. And the reason is Jeannette Rankin was a staunch pacifist, and she knew that both votes were going to have a significant negative impact on her career, her political career. And she didn't even run for re-election after the attacks on Pearl Harbor when she voted against World War II. But she never felt that war was the appropriate way to settle anything. And though I personally disagree with that, I have great respect for Jeannette Rankin. She was a person who stood by her convictions. And for that, I honor her and respect her. You know, here we are 104 years later after she was the first female elected to the House of Representatives. Let's go to the next slide. Then, as oftentimes happens, some people who are stupid push the issue and go one step too far. So on November 14th, 1917, a number of women suffragettes had been arrested in the District of Columbia during a protest, and they were, since the D.C. jails were full, they were shipped off down to Occoquan, Virginia, which is a little town about 15 miles south of the District of Columbia, and they were housed in the Occoquan Workhouse. And during the night of November 14th, 1917, the jailers there beat, abused, mistreated those women horribly. And again, it's one of those instances like we talked about in Birmingham, like we talked about in other places during the Civil Rights Movement, like we talked about at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday in Selma, where somebody goes so far over the line that the entire nation has to stop and look and reevaluate how things are going. So in 1917, Arkansas grants women the right to vote in the primaries, but not in general elections. Rhode Island grants women presidential suffrage so they can vote in presidential elections. New York, Oklahoma, South Dakota approves suffrage for women. The next year, taking this momentum that came out of this night of terror in Occoquan, Virginia, the 19th Amendment passes the House of Representatives, but it fails in the Senate. In 1919, the next year, Minnesota, Oklahoma, South Dakota grant women full suffrage to vote for everything. The Senate passes the 19th Amendment that year. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment that says voting cannot be restricted based on sex is ratified and becomes a part of the Constitution. In 1922, multiple cases make it to the United States Supreme Court challenging the 19th Amendment, which is kind of a unique thing to happen in American history, where the court is asked to overturn an actual amendment to the United States Constitution. Again, think about that for a second. The United States Supreme Court is there to arbitrate constitutional questions of whether or not this falls under the ideas that are set forth in the Constitution. Now they're being asked to overturn part of the Constitution, and nobody's ever actually figured out whether or not the Supreme Court can do that. Supreme Court didn't want to get into it. They upheld the amendment through multiple different court cases. But let me say this. It was 2 years later before Native American women gained the vote, as the Native Americans are all finally granted citizenship through the Indian Citizenship Act. I want you to take a second. I want you to think about that. Before 1924, Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States, even though they were here, when they get here. I know a guy who identifies himself, when they're talking about immigration issues. He calls himself, I'm a 300th generation American. Native American women weren't, even though in 1922 the court said, there should be no discrimination based on sex. Native American women did not gain the right to vote until the Native Americans were granted citizenship in 1924. In 1943, Chinese immigrants, including women who had become citizens, finally received the right to vote through the Magnuson Act. Again, I want you to think about that for a minute, that you could be a citizen of the United States, but because you were a Chinese immigrant, you were not allowed to vote. Okay? Then go to the next slide. And again, none of that. The 19th Amendment had no impact if you were an African American woman living in the South, because Jim Crow laws were still the order of the day, and no African Americans, or a very, very small, tiny percentage of African Americans in the South were allowed to vote until 1965 when the Voter Rights Act was passed. Okay? So, in women, and we could go in and we could look, I could go in and talk to you about the passage of the Magnuson Act that allowed Chinese immigrants to exercise their full rights as American citizens. We could go back and look at the Indian Citizenship Act, which would again allow us to look at a group of U.S. citizens, people who were born in this country, and just take a look at how long they had to wait before they were allowed to fully execute their right to vote. Okay, but again, we can say that even with the 19th Amendment, all women weren't allowed to vote until 1965 when the Voter Rights Act. And then let's jump all the way back to that second slide in 2018 when the Secretary of State of Georgia eliminated 340,000 people, most of them minorities, from the voting rolls based on a law that has previously hardly been used. So who gets to vote in an election has always been a challenge for the United States. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. What are we campaigning for anyway? The one thing you need to understand is, you got people in this country who are Democrats, you got people in this country who are Republicans, and a lot of people aren't going to vote for that, no matter what. In the South, there used to be a phrase called a yellow dog Democrat. That was somebody who would vote for a yellow dog if they were running on the Democratic ticket. In 2016, when it was Clinton versus Trump, less than 5%, less than 6% of the voters changed party from how they had voted in 2012. In other words, people who had voted for Obama, that voted for Trump in 2016, or people who had voted for Romney in 2012, that voted for Clinton in 2016. One of the most contested, possibly we can say one of the most contentious elections in recent history, and less than 6% of the voters changed parties. Political campaigns focus now on voters that are likely to vote but are undecided, and that is a very, very small percentage. Think about that for a minute. If you're decided who you're going to vote for going in, I don't need to campaign for you. Okay, your vote is already mine. I don't need to worry about that. If you're undecided and you're not likely to vote, don't need to worry about you either. Okay, because you're not going to come vote anyway. So what difference does it make? So what campaigns in the past have generally done is to try to focus on those likely voters that are undecided. Now, the second thing here in the issue they focus on also is turning out the party faithful. And this is what Trump did in 2016 that was really sort of stunning and really sort of completely shifted the way political campaigns at least have been run for the 4 years since then. Trump focused on getting out the party faithful and turning them into almost an angry mob, and getting them to the polls in enough numbers in key states to where it would have an impact. In the big fault that has been placed on Hillary Clinton was key states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. She didn't even go campaign in because there weren't that many undecided voters there. The concept was she wasn't going to get enough undecided voters to shift. It looks like they were fine. They were leading in the polls there, but Trump went in and excited the party faithful and pushed them to the limit to where they all came out and voted. And that's how he became president. In 2018, the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives by increasing the turnout in key demographics. Young minority groups increased their voting by 13 to 26% across the board. That is a massive increase in voting in a 2-year time. And again, those young, and 13 to 26%, it varied by groups, but that groundswell of exciting the party faithful, really changed the way campaigns were looked upon. Let's go to the next slide, and it says swing voters. Swing voter is somebody who will vote Democrat one election, Republican the next election, or switch back and forth. Some estimates say that as few as 7% of voters are going to change party between elections. Okay, there are really very few independent voters, and they say about 7%. But if those voters all break one way, it can be a huge shift in electorate. 2016, swing voters generally went for Trump, and that gave him the election. Low voter turnout magnified the impact because Democrats were so disenchanted with Hillary Clinton. She'd been around for so long. There was very little for her to get excited about. That they just didn't turn out. So you take that 7% shift and you throw it to Trump while Democrats aren't turning out to vote in key states, and Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. And again, the Electoral College had an impact because Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. Now, the Kaiser Family Foundation believes swing voters may be as high as 30%, but they're only going to vote when they're extremely motivated. So we talked about turning out the base and turning, the undecided voters who will vote. So even though, if you take that, you've got 35% of the electorate is Republican, 35% of the electorate is Democrat, and then there's this 30% in the middle, but those 30% don't normally vote. So the difference between that first estimate up at the top is 7% of voters. The Kaiser Family Foundation says maybe as much as a third of the country aren't decided, but they're not going to vote on a regular basis unless they're really highly motivated. One of the things they're talking about for this election coming up in November is that these undecided voters may be massively motivated at this point to go out and vote, and everyone is watching to see how that breaks. Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk about identity politics. Okay, identity politics is a very contentious topic. The definition is listed here: political activity or movements based on catering to the cultural, ethnic, gender, racial, religious, or social interests that are characterize a group identity. And that is basically it's an attempt to identify voters and votes based on demographic issues. It became an expression of oppressed classes, minorities, women, LGBTQ, and we're going to talk about that, voters, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. It became an expression that our group will never be represented by the dominant class, no matter what their political affiliation is, if we don't vote, period. The dominant class, we cannot continue, even though this is a liberal white male is not going to understand the problems of a black female. So to have appropriate representation, I, as a black female, have to vote for a black female. Now, we can argue that, and it's a very contentious concept, but it is a concept that is being worked. Let's go to the next slide. Identity politics really was born in the mid-1970s by the Combahee River Collective, and now that is one of the most important political groups in the United States that you never heard of. It was very short-lived. It only lasted from 1974 to 1980. It came out of Boston, but it focused on the fact that the feminist movement at that time, which was being run, managed, and the faces of all the people in the feminist movement were white. And the Combahee River Collective was made up of black feminist lesbians, And here you can say they issued a statement in 1977 which said in part, as children, we realized that we were different from boys and that we were treated different. For example, we were told in the same breath to be quiet, both for the sake of being ladylike and to make us less objectionable in the eyes of white people. In the process of consciousness raising, actually life sharing, we began to recognize the commonality of our experience, and from the sharing and growing consciousness to build politics that will change our lives and inevitably end our oppression. So what the members of the Combahee River Collective were saying is, white feminists cannot adequately represent us. We have to represent ourselves. And this is going to be, since 1974, we're now talking about 45 years. This was just earth-shaking a concept in politics. To where people were saying, a good white man isn't going to be able to appropriately represent me as a black, and in this case with the Combahee River Collective, as a black female lesbian. I cannot be represented by anyone other than someone who looks like me. Go to the next slide. So the first broad-based identity politics movement was the LGBTQ community, as it was known back then, gay rights, but is now known as the LGBTQ community. By the 1980s, it had become important for a candidate who wanted to work toward LGBTQ equality. Many of them had to come out and identify themselves as homosexual. And this started out in California, and it then grew across the country. A lot of candidates that campaigned as being LGBTQ allies who were gay themselves that had not come out were outed in a horrible practice that now is really it happened in Alabama a couple of years ago, where the governor, Kay Ivey, who was a female who's never been married, was outed by a state senator, or theoretically outed. The state senator claimed that she was a lesbian. And everybody turned on her, because now that practice is now rejected even by members of the LGBTQ community. Inevitably, this leads to people who begun to a split within the identity politics movement, and this is how all identity politics movements go. As the movement becomes more mainstream, the need to identify becomes less important, and we've seen this a lot in this last election cycle. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, mayor from Indiana, was a gay man. He ran, did very well in the Democratic primaries, did not feel the need to make a statement about the fact that he was married to another man really at any point in time in his election process. He would discuss it if asked, but he did not need to make it his identity within the political system. But if you go to that bottom bullet, those who cling to the identity will become radicalized and feel disaffected as the movement moves into the mainstream. So, again, strangely enough, and this is the sort of the what happens with identity politics, is that radicals within that within the LGBTQ community became very disgruntled with Mayor Pete. Because he did not make his sexual orientation the focus of his campaign. They thought he should be discussing his trials as a gay man every time he got up to speak, and he just refused to do that, because it is no longer necessary within the American community to focus on that. It's just not that, to him, to Mayor Pete, it was just not going to be that much of an issue. So members of the LGBTQ community radicalized and were actually campaigning against him, because they did not feel he was serving his identity sufficiently. Okay, let's go to the next slide, which is, again, identity politics. So identity politics has worked. No Democratic presidential nominee has received less than 82% of the black vote since Kennedy's 68% in 1960. No Republican presidential nominee has done better than Eisenhower's 39% in 1956. I mean, that's just a simple statement of fact. Democrats built a powerful coalition by identifying oppressed groups that were out of the mainstream and brought them into the Democratic Party. That includes blacks, LGBTQ community, the Latinos, and the immigrants. and they brought them in, and they built a powerful coalition. They got President Clinton elected, got President Obama elected. Go to the next slide. The Republicans really didn't have a response. While Democrats were more than willing to go out and say to the African American community and say, we will serve the African American community. We will serve the LGBTQ community. We will serve Latinos. We will serve immigrants, and we will serve your specific problem. It was very difficult for the Republicans to go out and say, hey, we're going to take care of you white people. It became very difficult for them to say that. They had white became the absence of race and not a race. White became, and again, remember, we've discussed in class before that race is a social construct. Who is and who isn't white varies. Remember, we talked about Ta-Nehisi Coates, who shows that race is a social construct and not genetic. So Donald Trump actively and aggressively mobilized a white underclass. And again, remember, he wasn't reaching across the aisle. He wasn't trying to find undecided voters. He wanted to mobilize a base of the white underclass. And there's plenty of documentation out here on this. You know, some people will argue with that, but if you look, there's plenty of documentation to show that. It became the first campaign that openly courted the white identity since George Wallace. Remember, the first thing Donald Trump said in his very first campaign, and when he announced that he was running for president, he referred to Mexican immigrants as rapists and murderers. He said, they're sending us all their rapists and murderers. He said that over and over again. The New York Times, Leila Lalami said that the president-elect earned the votes of the majority of white people while running a campaign that explicitly and consistently appealed to white identity and white anxiety. At the heart of this anxiety is white people's increasing awareness that they will become a statistical minority in this country within a generation. The paradox is that they have no language to speak about their own identity. White is a category that has afforded them an evasion from race rather than an opportunity to confront it. Trump gave birth to what's known as white identity politics. And you see this over and over again. Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, his advisors, and Stephen Miller is still there, courted this white identity politics and said that, you know, you hear them, people, Sebastian Gorka, people who work closely with the president, would talk about how great European history was and we owe everything we have to European history. Stephen King, who was a Republican member of the U.S. House of Representatives, openly admitted that he's a white nationalist. And the Republican Party then kicked him off all his committee assignments. But this idea of a white identity politics became a big deal and got President Trump elected. Now the question is, can he mobilize that base again in 2020? Okay, so let's go to the next slide, identity politics in 2016. Excuse me. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton was running for president as the Democratic nominee. The Democrats were splintered. Identity politics might not get them elected as it had, but they were obliged. They knew that a lot of Democrats were saying, we know that identity politics and just bringing in these minority groups, these disenfranchised groups, may not get us to the election, but we have to keep pushing. Traditional Republicans hesitate to embrace the label of white identity politics, but they're very aware that it's how they won the White House. Economically disadvantaged white leverage the same benefits economically disadvantaged minorities do, and people are beginning to realize that as the economy begins to stratify and income inequality begins to grow even further, where the middle class in the United States begins to dwindle, where you've got people that are working for minimum wage or just barely above minimum wage in our service economy, and those people, you know, as Bernie Sanders refers to as the 1%, those people move further and further away. It begins to become clear that whites and minorities all are working on the same economic benefits and the same benefits given to them. You know, as the term minorities grow more and more economically powerful, and separated from the economically powerful isn't necessarily politically powerful, can the Republicans engage these voters? And that became the question after 2016. If whites become the majority in this country, or the minority in this country, what does identity politics even mean anymore? My dad used to tell me, my dad, again, I've referred to my dad a couple of times. My dad was a really smart guy. And he understood, when George Wallace was running for governor in Alabama, running for president of the United States, using a white identity politics as his only campaign platform. We're going to, he was explicitly saying, we're going to keep the blacks in their place. We're going to advance the whites in the state. My dad used to tell me that the best friend of a poor white man has always been the poor black man. And the fact that George Wallace managed to split those two would be to the disservice of the state of Alabama for decades. And it turned out my dad was absolutely correct on that point. But now, as we move past 2016, can Donald Trump, in running for re-election for president in 2020, can he stir up that white identity political base and bring enough of those people to the polls? Or can the Democrats, under apparently now Joe Biden, bring enough people to the polls to sort of push past that in enough states to gain the Electoral College? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So for a lot of people, it's not about identity politics. We look at issues, and here's just a list of issues. Healthcare, the economy, abortion, immigration, gender issues, marital equality, guns, taxes, foreign affairs, income inequality, Supreme Court nominees, climate change, and foreign tampering in U.S. elections. This was a survey that was recently done to show what people care about in coming up to the 2020 election. And so you have to ask yourself, can one person line up with us on every single one of these issues? Now, the way our primaries run, in order to get the faithful out to vote for you so that you get the nomination, you have to line up to the extreme left or the extreme right of your party. I have to believe in Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, or again, the Democratic primaries broke down into the extreme left wing, which was Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, to a certain extent Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, to a certain extent. And then the moderate wing, which was Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Joe Biden, clearly, and those were the leaders in each of those areas. But none of them would check a box, no matter what, because Bernie Sanders wanted Medicare for all. He wanted a socialist democratic economy. He was pro-choice. He believed in immigration reform. He was very far to the left on gender issues and marriage equality. But Bernie Sanders had a very loose attitude toward guns in the past. And so it's very difficult, unless you're going to get generic candidate here, can one person line up with us on all the issues? And it becomes, well, if they don't, how do we pick who we're going to vote for? Okay? There's two theories. Go to the next one. So why vote? Got a picture of one of my favorite presidents, Theodore Roosevelt. Two theories. First, find the candidate that lines up with you on most of the issues, and then you compromise. The second, you vote for an honest candidate and assume they'll pursue honest policies. And as it said in the textbook, the goal of any truly democratic election should be to get competent, non-corrupt leaders into a position of power. So let's go to the next slide, how to choose a candidate. So the campaign can be decided based on candidates' perceived character. Voters will generally choose based on two types of issues. First of all, there's valence issues. We want honest, compassionate, strong, intellectually and emotional people. We all want the same things in life: a strong economy, good education, and a strong national defense. And a good person, even though we disagree on how we move forward in that and get that, will ultimately lead us to the place that most people want to be. The other issue is positional issues. We could care less what kind of person the candidate is. But if he lines up on our positions, hey, that's where we're going to vote. And the two best examples of a valence candidate and a positional candidate are Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan got millions of Democrats, including myself, to vote for him. We were known as Reagan Democrats. I've been a member of the Democratic Party most of my entire life, but for many, many years I voted as a Republican because Ronald Reagan was, I perceived, and again, my first presidential election was in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter. He seemed like a man with strong character. He seemed like a man that was honest. He seemed like a man that had the best intention and a vision for the United States that would take us to the place where we needed to be. And so even though I realized, Ronald Reagan ran on three things. I'm going to cut taxes. I'm going to increase defense spending. And and you can't do both. You can't, and I'm going to lower the federal deficit. Well, if you cut taxes and you increase spending, guess what happens? You increase the federal deficit. And we all knew that this wasn't going to happen, and it was probably impossible for him to do. But Reagan seemed like an honest, and on the valence issues, honesty, compassion, strong. And of good character. He seemed to be our man. So millions of Americans switched from being Democrats to being what was known as Reagan Democrats. We weren't really thrilled with the Republican Party, but we voted with the Republicans because the valence issues were with President Reagan. Now, the opposite of that is Donald Trump. This is where people could care less. And again, we have these what we call value voters now, as they like to describe themselves. Voters who believe they're pro-life, they're pro-guns, they're anti-immigration, and many of them want to stop immigration overall. They fall into what we call the evangelical movement of people who believe that everything should be based on their religion, and they vote the way God wants them to vote. Now, if you go back and you look at these people and what they claim to believe in, and you stand Donald Trump next to that list, they will openly acknowledge that he's dishonest, that he has serious trouble telling the truth. They openly acknowledge that his business practices are fraudulent. They openly acknowledge that he has had multiple extramarital affairs. They openly admit that all of these things are in contradiction to the values they claim to advocate. And yet, they still vote for him because he's appointing conservative judges to the courts. He's in support of legislation that will ban all abortions in the United States. He will not allow any sort of anti-gun legislation to be passed while he's president. He's locking up immigrants on the borders. Now, I'm not going to tell you those people are wrong because that's their right to do that. And if they have an informed opinion, and if they can, look at what they consider to be their key and important ideas, that's a positional issue, and they're positional issue voters, and they absolutely have a right to do that. Let's go to the next slide. You'll remember this, hopefully, from one of our earlier lectures on the legislature. And again, this is how should a member vote, and this is how it's operationalized. Are members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, are they delegates, are they trustees, or do they take the organizational view? This is the same thing. When we vote for a member of the House of Representatives, we've been focused on the president a lot, but when we vote for a senator or a member of the House of Representatives, do we vote for someone who believes they would vote by setting policy? By voting for him where, he goes to vote and he says, clearly the public opinion polls show that my voters want me to vote this way. Or are we electing someone and we say, hey, listen, you're a good, honest person. Do your best and vote the way you feel. Okay? It's the same basic argument that we've had throughout. But remember, if you go strictly on positional, you can't satisfy everybody all the time. Okay, so most people turn out to be valence issue voters. So remember, valence and positional issues. Okay, go to the next slide. Let's start talking about the mechanics of the election. So everybody's talking about how on November 3rd, 2020, we're going to hold a presidential election. How many elections are we going to hold? If you ask most people, they'd say one election. Well, no, actually, we're holding 51 elections to elect members to the Electoral College, and that's how the president gets elected. But you can also say there are going to be 469 elections for members of the House of Representatives and 35 senators and one president. That's 460. That's each of those are being elected independently from different districts. Every one of those elections, you can say the president is a nationwide election, the senators are statewide, and the House of Representatives elections are district-wide. We're also going to be electing 11 governors on November 3rd, 2020. You can also add the thousands of state legislatures who are going to be elected. 86 of 99 state houses are going to hold elections on November 3rd, 2020. That's another at least 8,600 different positions that are going to be elected. Now, a lot of times a lot of people will be cynical, but I want you to think about this. So we're now talking about nearly 9,000 separate elections are going to be held. Each in a different, and then we're going to add in mayors, and we're going to add in city councils, and we're going to add in, members of your school board that are going to be elected, members of your county commission. So on November 3rd, 2020, there are going to be tens of thousands of elections happening in the United States. And it's all going to happen in an orderly fashion and with a few questions as to the legitimacy of the outcome. You guys don't remember the 2000 election. You weren't born then, but what happened was that at the end of the night, when normally they would announce the president who was the new president, Florida's votes had not come in yet. Florida votes would be contested. And Al Gore in the Democratic Party sued to get a recount of the Florida elections. And that recount went back and forth for weeks. And it was well into December before we knew who the next president of the United States was going to be. I was stationed in the United Kingdom. We were living in England at the time, and I remember listening to the BBC. And the BBC, one of the things they pointed out was one of the BBC commentators were trying to say, well, look at how crazy these Americans are. This is insane. This is how do they call themselves a democracy? And one of the reporters from the United States pointed out that, yeah, you want to know what? They don't know who the next president is going to be. They don't know what party is going to be in power next in January when they inaugurate the new president. But you know what? Nobody's calling out the troops. There have been no riots. There have been no threats of one political party to leave the government. This is being settled in the courts. The courts will ultimately, and even at that point, very early on, we know the Supreme Court of the United States is going to decide this. And when that decision is made, it will be accepted as law. And the next president of the United States will be selected. So even though we sort of yell and scream at each other sometimes, and sometimes we get very upset at the outcomes, our elections happen in a very orderly fashion that really should be respected by the entire world, and in many cases it is. Now, is it perfect? Oh, God, no. It is absolutely not perfect. And we'll start talking about that because let's go to the next slide. This is how to become president of the United States, and this is the last slide we're going to have for the day. I mean, it is just, the Constitution sets a threshold. You have to be a natural-born U.S. citizen, which means you have to be born in the United States or you have to be born of U.S. citizen parents. You have to be at least 35 years of age, and you have to be a resident of the United States for 14 years. Well, you say if you were a natural-born U.S. citizen and you were, how shouldn't you be? The qualification there is for, I've got a friend of mine, Eric. He was born in Germany. His father was in the U.S. Army. His mother was a U.S. citizen, so he was a natural-born U.S. citizen. But if he had stayed in Germany for his entire life and then moved back, he would have to wait 14 years before he could run for president. And again, also that was, if you recall, back when the Constitution was written, all of those people nobody was a natural-born U.S. citizen. So there were people that were outside because they had all been British subjects up till, the day we won the war. So that was something put in place back then. Then we have the primaries and the caucuses, and that determines delegates to go to the national conventions, which you may or may not see in August this year, depending on the COVID-19 pandemic. And then after you get the nominees officially chosen, you have the presidential candidates that have a general election that elect people, that elect members of the Electoral College, which are the same number as the senators and House of Representative members from each state. And then the Electoral College meets, and if the president is elected, and the Electoral College puts him in place, and then in January 20th, the new president is inaugurated, and they become president January 21st, if the 20th is on a Sunday. If the president-elect dies between the election and between the electoral election and the inauguration, the vice president-elect becomes president. There's all sorts of, but it is complex. It is convoluted. It takes, there are people, I promise you, that on November 4th of 2020 are going to announce they're running for president in 2024. Some of these campaigns take 4 years. Some people run for 12 years in a row. Joe Biden's been running for president since the 1970s, off and on. But it works. Our system works. Okay? That's the one thing we have to understand, and as frustrating as it is, and as there were people who hated President Obama. There are people that hate President Trump. But our system continues to work. It's shaky at times. We don't oftentimes embrace everyone we should, but our system on a whole generally seems to work. Okay? So that's our message for today. You can take identity politics, you can take a lie that there's no constitutional right to vote, that through the federalist system, the Constitution throws all the authority for who does and doesn't get to vote back to the states, and the states have really been horrible stewards of that. Not really picking the people that should be who should be allowed to do things. But overall, our system works, and we're going to see it work again. You'll see it work in November 3rd, 2020. 2 years after that, you guys will be eligible to vote for governor of South Carolina, and the members of the South Carolina, you'll be able to elect your members of the House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives. I think you've got one senator coming up in 2022, so you'll be able to vote for a U.S. senator, and you will be able to participate in that process. Okay, all right, so we're going to sign off here for the day. We will continue with elections first the next week. You will get your discussion board question for when that lecture is posted. Again, remember this was supposed to be spring break. I was actually supposed to be in Savannah this weekend at the Savannah Music Festival. Well, that didn't happen. But again, just sort of, and then you'll get another review for the final, and that'll happen. So, okay, stay safe, stay well, stay distant, and make sure that you're taking care of yourselves and all your family. Again, feel free to send me an email. You've got my email if you have any questions. And if you haven't done the extra credit already, go ahead and get that done. All right, take care and stay safe.